On a cold November night in 1619, a dream took place that would forever change how we understand the world, how we understand ourselves, and how we conceptualize reality. Some have called this moment the most disastrous moment in the history of Europe. Others have called it the birth of the modern world. I call this moment the night that our understanding of what is real would forever change. Because after that cold November night that took place over 400 years ago, nothing about how we understand the world around us would ever be the same again. And this isn't a well-known moment. Even in academia, most academics don't really know all that much about the night of November 10 in 1619. You kind of hear about it through whispers, kind of like a well-kept secret. And the reason this event is not really talked about all that much is because it's kind of embarrassing. It's embarrassing because the birth of the modern world and some of the core ideas that would go on to shape the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and even the scientific method itself, in addition to this whole idea that reason is superior to other forms of knowing, actually has its origins in a series of highly irrational and unreasonable dreams that took place over 400 years ago. My name is AJ. I've been studying dreams and other related topics in academia for just a bit over 12 years now. And in this video, I'd like to show you how a series of really strange dreams ended up completely changing the way we understand reality, ourselves, and the world we live in.
6,
6, 2,
5.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine.
Having said all of that, before we start getting into the whole dream thing, let's first set the stage and start looking a bit at the background of how all of this happened. Here's the background. So there's this young guy traveling with the Dutch States Army, and he's serving as an engineer and mathematician. He's traveling to discover himself because he kind of grew disappointed with not being able to reconcile his Christian education or his Christian worldview with the emerging scientific worldview of the 17th century. So he was basically grappling with deep existential questions about the nature of reality, why do we exist, and those kind of things. And on November 10 in 1619, his regiment ended up passing through this small German town right by the Danube River, which went by the name of Neuburg. And given that not all that much happened that day, at least from a military perspective, the young man ended up retreating in this famously poorly heated room where he spent the whole day thinking about ideas. And on that night, he had what I personally believe to be the most consequential series of dreams in all of recorded human history. And this is because these dreams would go on to shape the entire intellectual infrastructure of Western culture. And because Western culture would go on to be so influential, these dreams and their aftermath would go on to change the overarching intellectual infrastructure of the entire world. And as we will see in just a moment, at the core of these dreams, there was basically this one question. How can we know for sure what's real versus what's not real? And ultimately, it was the way he answered this question that would go on and completely transform the way we look at absolutely everything around us. So, what were these dreams? What could a random young guy who was traveling with the Dutch States Army through the town of Neuburg possibly have dreamt about that would be so monumental as to change the entire course of human history? In the first dream, this is what basically happens. The young man finds himself walking down a street when suddenly a ghost appears and completely terrifies him. The young man feels weakness on the right side of his body, so he then stumbles to his left, which kind of embarrasses him. And then as he tries to correct his posture, this violent gust of wind kind of attacks him out of nowhere and spins him around 3 or 4 times on his leg. So he decides to seek refuge in a nearby school chapel where he wanted to go and pray. And as he walks towards this chapel, he feels like he's going to fall. Every single step he takes feels wobbly. And as this is happening, he passes by an old acquaintance in the middle of the road who stops to greet him. But the wind just keeps violently pushing him forward, onward, towards the chapel. And eventually he makes it to the schoolyard, And once there, someone from the schoolyard just calls his name and tells him that Monsieur N has something to give him. And for some reason, the young man imagines that Monsieur N wants to give him a melon from another country, which I know sounds really random. And honestly, way too many people have spilled way too much ink trying to decipher the supposed hidden meaning of the melon. But it really doesn't matter because the melon really doesn't come back in any significant shape or form. So let's just let the melon go. The young man then wakes up and he's obviously super freaked out by all of this. The ghost, the violent wind, the stranger, the random melon, and so forth. So after about 2 hours, he finally falls back to sleep. And this is when he has the second dream, or better said, this is when he has the second strange sleep event of the night. And basically what happens in the second event is that he suddenly wakes up in the middle of the night hearing this extremely loud, thunder-esque sound, almost like a thunderclap, which really frightens him because he couldn't really tell what was happening or where the sound was actually coming from. And he then sees all of these like electric sparks or sparks of fire jumping around the room. So while all of this strangeness is happening in his room, he eventually does a double take, rubs his eyes kind of thing, and then when he looks around his room again, he notices that the sparks have practically disappeared. And later on, the young man started believing that the electric sparks of fire he saw dancing around in his room, or the thunder-esque sound and so forth, he ended up interpreting all of these to mean that the spirit of truth had descended into him to possess him in order to initiate him for the final dream of the night, the big one. And just moments later, after this really strange and charged event, which a modern neuroscientist would probably flag as exploding head syndrome, he finally has the third dream of the night, the one that would forever go on to change the entire essence of Western culture. So, what exactly happened in the last dream that took place on the night of November 10 in 1619? What was this dream that we've been building up to all of this time actually about? And in this third and final dream, the young man finds himself standing by a table. And on that table, suddenly, out of nowhere, a dictionary appears right in front of him. But then moments later, something else happens that captures his attention. A second book just randomly appears in his hand. And this second book happens to be a collection of Roman poetry. So, intrigued by all of this, he decides to ignore the boring dictionary and instead starts flickering through the poetry book. And then lands on a verse by the Roman poet Ausonius, which reads, quote, "Which path in life shall I take?" Unquote. And this is interesting because, as you'll recall, the reason this young man joined the Dutch State's army and the reason he ended up finding himself in the German town of Newburgh on the night of November 10 in 1619 was precisely because he had all of these existential questions and he didn't really know what path in life he should take. So this verse really resonated with him because it really got to the heart of the problem he was wrestling with. Shortly after he comes across this verse, a stranger then suddenly just materializes in front of him. And the stranger then starts quoting him another verse from the poetry book. But this one's really bizarre. It really doesn't make all that much sense when you first hear it. Quote, "What is and what is not." Unquote. That's it. That's the full verse that would forever go on to change the course of history. And the young man gets really excited when he hears this because he remembers seeing this verse somewhere earlier in the poetry book. So he kind of goes like, "Oh, I know that verse. Let me show it to you in the poetry book." So he starts flipping through the pages of the poetry book, but he realizes that he can't find the verse. And not only that, but the poems themselves seem to start disappearing from the pages of the book. And the pages of the book then start getting filled with all sorts of small images instead, like small portraits. So, confused by all of this, he looks for the dictionary, the one left on the table, and notices that the dictionary is incomplete. It looks like parts of the dictionary itself have also started disappearing. So, really confused by all of this, he then looks back at the stranger, kind of like, "Hey, are you also seeing all of this strangeness?" But instead of getting a response, the stranger himself also starts disappearing. So all of this is obviously really weird. And because of all of these super surreal things that just keep happening around him, he eventually realizes that the only logical explanation for all of this is that he must be dreaming. So instead of waking up or further exploring the dream, what he does is that he starts analyzing the dream and everything that's just happened to him right there and then from inside the dream. And he decides right there and then that the incomplete dictionary represents the incomplete state of science, that science is still unfinished, and that human knowledge is still in the process of developing. He then wakes up and continues to think about the dream. Specifically, he continues to obsess over the cryptic verse that the stranger had quoted him, the whole what is and what is not thing. And overall, convinces himself that what had basically happened is that a genuinely divine message had been delivered to him in that third and final dream of the night. He came to believe that the sparks from the second dream came from the spirit of truth and that he had been instructed to follow a divine mission. He started thoroughly believing that he had been instructed by a divine messenger to develop a way through which he can start reliably distinguishing what's real from what's not real. And regarding the first verse, the one that said, "What path in life shall I take?" he took that as a form of career guidance from a higher power, and that he had been instructed to dedicate his entire life to discover a way to unify science, philosophy, and religion. That's how he ended up interpreting the meaning of the three dreams he had on the night of November 10 in 1619. So, after having these three dreams in the town of Newburgh, this young man who would go on to become no one other than René Descartes goes straight to work and tries to figure out a way to solve the divine riddle he believed he had received in the last dream of the night. And after thinking quite a bit about the dreams and especially how to address the whole what is and what is not challenge, he eventually arrives at two major conclusions that would go on to completely change the intellectual foundation of Western culture. And this first insight he has revolves around this famous thought experiment, which people now generally refer to as the dream doubt argument. And the idea is that this moment, right now, could very well be a dream. Dreams, after all, can replicate absolutely all sensory experiences. This is why, for example, nightmares are frightening. They're frightening because they feel real. They feel indistinguishable from reality. Just as an example, what if you're dreaming right now? How could you really know if you're not inside a dream right now? And after thinking about all of this for a while, Descartes eventually arrives at the conclusion that we can never really be 100% sure if we're currently dreaming or not. And this is true even for lucid dreamers. Even expert lucid dreamers cannot be lucid 100% of the time. Sooner or later, dreaming will eventually trick you, and you will eventually mistake the dream world for wakefulness. That's essentially the basis of the dreamed out argument. And this whole dreamed out argument thing basically becomes the core pillar of a large chunk of Descartes' later thinking and philosophy. But he doesn't stop there. The dreamed out argument is just the beginning. He reasons, what if it's even worse? We cannot tell whether we're dreaming or not, but what if we're actually in some sort of simulated reality? What if the world we're currently living in isn't the real world at all? What if right now, in this very moment, we're actually inside something akin to the Matrix? How would we be able to tell? As Morpheus famously puts it to Neo in the original Matrix film,
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
or what if it's even worse and we're just brains in a vat? Like in the famous brain in a vat thought experiment. Our brains are hypothetically removed and placed in a life-sustaining liquid, and then connected to a supercomputer, which is fed electrical impulses identical to what the body normally produces. From our perspective, nothing would feel different. we would still be able to experience everything we normally experience with our bodies, except in this case, it would all be just a computer simulation. Now, Descartes obviously doesn't use neuroscientific language to describe this point. Instead, he uses religious language and develops this really weird and frightening thought experiment, which most people now generally refer to as the maleficent demon argument. And he comes up with this really bizarre argument where he asks us to imagine a maleficent demon or a maleficent deity that would deliberately create a fake world for us to inhabit. He basically asks us to try and imagine the most deceitful, evil, and all-powerful entity that we can ever think of. Just to give you the full quote, because it's really interesting to get a sense of just how Descartes was thinking about all of this.
I will suppose, therefore, that not God who is supremely good and the source of truth, but rather some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning has employed all his energy in deceiving me. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely the delusions of dreams which he has devised to ensnare my judgment.
So again, it goes back to the same point. What if everything we experience is an illusion planted in our brains or planted in our minds by some sort of powerful evil entity? How would we be able to tell if what we're currently experiencing is base reality or just a fake version of reality? And these two ideas, the dreamed out argument coupled with the maleficent demon argument, would go on to form the foundation of what's often referred to as Descartes' radical doubt project. The radical doubt project was this idea that let's just doubt everything and see what's left, because whatever is left must be some sort of fundamental truth about the nature of reality. So you can kind of see how he ended up taking the whole what is and what is not verse pretty seriously. And after spending a lot of time trying to figure out what's real and what's not real about the world, he arrives at this core insight that would ultimately become the bedrock of his entire philosophy. He concludes that yes, we can doubt absolutely everything. We cannot really know if we're currently asleep or not. And we also cannot really know if we're actually inside some sort of simulated reality that's just masquerading as the real world instead of actually being the real world. But what we can know is that in order to doubt or in order to question if our world is real or not, something must be doing the doubting, or that something must be doing the questioning, at least in some shape or form. And he really zeroes in on this idea that our thinking is something that we can be certain of. You know, everything might be an illusion, but because I think and doubt, I can know that therefore I, as a thinking self, must exist in some shape or form. And this is basically how he comes up with the famous proposition that you've probably heard of many, many times before. And that is, quote, I think, therefore I am, unquote. So by saying that, he kind of affirms that the part of ourselves that's capable of thinking and questioning and doubting must have some sort of level of realness to it that nothing else really has. And what this idea really does in the long term is that it establishes thinking or cognition or reason as the basis of reality, or as one of the basic things we can rely on in order to build knowledge, or in order to figure out how the world actually works. So this was the first major contribution that came out of those dreams, and it established reason as fundamental, or in other words, it established reason as the most reliable path to knowledge, because reason is the only thing that we can absolutely be certain of. This line of thinking ended up being incredibly persuasive. A lot of later thinkers would adopt this whole I think therefore I am proposition, and the whole idea that reason is somehow supreme over other forms of knowing. Descartes' proposition ended up influencing the Enlightenment, it ended up influencing the scientific revolution, and it ultimately became the basis of how all of us in modern culture relate to knowledge. We've all absorbed this idea that reason is somehow supreme to other forms of knowledge or knowing. And of course, the irony of all of this is that the idea that reason is supreme came from a highly irrational series of dreams. Before Descartes' contribution, there was this strong idea that tradition, intuitions, intimations, dreams, divine revelations, spiritual intuitions, and so forth were also valid forms of knowing or valid forms of obtaining information about the universe. But after Descartes, all of those traditional methods of knowing started to be considered illegitimate or superstitious. So this was, again, his first major contribution. But before we wrap up the video, there was another second major contribution that came out of those dreams and which would go on to have an even larger impact on Western culture than even the whole "I think, therefore I am" proposition. In fact, it was the second insight Descartes had about the world that would make William Temple, the Bishop of Manchester, declare the night of November 10 in 1619 as the most disastrous moment in the history of Europe. And this is because it was this second insight that would go on to completely transform the way we see ourselves and everything we see around us. And this is the idea that the mind and body can be seen as two completely separate things or as two completely separate essences. See, prior to Descartes, Western culture saw the mind and body as different expressions of the same underlying process or the same underlying spiritual essence. Up until that point in time, the soul and body were seen as springing from the same source, and that they were somehow holistically integrated. This was a view that was very much dominant in both Hebrew and early Christian traditions. This is why, for example, both Hebrew and early Christian traditions placed such a high emphasis on the idea of physical resurrection. The body and soul were seen as two different sides of the same coin. They were seen as two things that needed each other in order to exist, or in other words, they were seen as being part of a deeply integrated union. This was basically the default mainstream philosophical and theological view of the world in Western culture before Descartes started articulating his philosophy. But after Descartes, this holistic view was replaced by the idea that the mind and body can exist completely separate from each other. So, by thinking this way, and by also visiting the Palace of Versailles of all places and witnessing some really strange hydraulic statues there, Descartes started putting together this philosophical idea that the mind and body are two completely separate things. See, the Palace of Versailles at that time had these hydraulic statues on display, and the statues could move, they could dance, they could play musical instruments, they could do all sorts of realistic movements. So, because he was already thinking about the mind and body as being two separate things when he saw those really weird hydraulic statues in the royal gardens of Versailles, he started imagining the mind acting a bit like a non-physical puppeteer that can control and influence the body in a super mechanistic way. The idea was that the mind connects with the body through the pineal gland, and the pineal gland is this unitary structure in the brain. So it's a single thing, just like how the mind is perceived to be a single thing, even though it's far more complicated than that. And the argument was that the soul enters the body through the pineal gland and then controls everything from there. And by coming up with this argument for the whole mind-body duality idea, he also achieved, in his mind at least, another one of his goals, namely how to reconcile or how to make sense of Christianity within the context of the emerging scientific worldview of the 17th century. The idea was that science can have everything physical, the body, the physical world, nature, etc., while Christianity and religion can have the mind, the soul, and everything that's non-physical. And the impact of this whole Cartesian mind-body duality cannot be overstated. It ended up affecting absolutely everything. This is probably why you might not think of this idea as being all that revolutionary, because this is pretty much the default way of seeing the world that we all grow up with in Western culture. And it ended up affecting everything from art, politics, medicine, science, spirituality, metaphysics, psychology, early neuroscience, and even how we approach things like artificial intelligence. A lot of the advancements in these fields over the last 400 years were based on this idea that the mind is fundamentally different from the body and that the mind is ultimately a thinking instrument. And to this day, we still see this dichotomy between mind and body being deeply embedded in Western culture. This isn't even about metaphysics or spiritual ideas. Even the way medicine is still practiced today still largely revolves around this Cartesian idea that the mind and body are different systems or different things entirely. You know, we go to see mental health specialists when we have mental health problems, and we go to see physicians when we have physical health problems, as if the mind and body were two disconnected units. Or we have ideas like mind over body, or the idea that our psychology is somehow different from our physiology, or even things like the idea that we're currently living inside a computer simulation. Who or what exactly is supposed to be inside a computer simulation right now? And the implicit answer is our minds. Our mind is supposed to be trapped inside a computer simulation. Because even when it comes to the most physical and computerized ways of seeing the world, we all still implicitly believe that the mind is something that can be extracted from the body and placed into another physical container. And this is all really because of Descartes and those really strange dreams he had over 400 years ago. So the next time someone tells you that dreams don't matter or that dreams are meaningless, frivolous things, I encourage you to tell them about the night of November 10 in 1619. And now, if just 3 dreams were able to reshape how we see the entire world around us, the question I want to leave you with is, how much do you think that the 8 billion plus dreams that we all have on a nightly basis on this planet are actively impacting and shaping the world around us?
2、6、5、10。